For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was the gatekeeper of American comedy, ushering the nation's funniest minds onto the Tonight Show stage. His easy charm and infectious laugh put comedians at ease, sparking moments of unplanned magic that millions adored. But away from the cameras and applause, Carson often saw something darker. Those who knew him well said the legendary host had a keen sense of recall for cruelty. He would watch a performer make an audience roar with laughter, only to see that same person berate a low-level staff member minutes later. Carson remembered these moments, and over time, he began to keep a private list of comedians whose public kindness was a mask for real-life cruelty. These were the names he quietly detested: people who played lovable, generous, or wholesome characters on stage, but who, in his eyes, were deeply unpleasant once the spotlight dimmed. The first name on Carson's secret blacklist was Jerry Lewis, the humanitarian with a heart of stone. To the public, Lewis was the goofy, lovable clown whose annual muscular dystrophy telethons made him a hero of compassion. Yet, according to Carson's private observations, Lewis's true nature was far removed from that image. Behind the scenes, Lewis was arrogant, demanding, and often cruel. Crew members recalled how his visits to The Tonight Show filled the studio with tension. He would arrive surrounded by an entourage that catered to his every whim, lash out at assistants for trivial mistakes, and treat staff, especially women, with disdain. One infamous incident during the mid-1970s reportedly cemented his reputation in Carson's mind. During a commercial break, a young intern entered Lewis's dressing room with a message, only to be met with a tirade so vicious she quit television altogether. Carson was furious when he heard about it and made sure the young woman received a formal apology from the show's producers. But he never forgave Lewis. What disturbed Carson even more was the hypocrisy of Lewis's public image. While the comedian cried on camera for children with muscular dystrophy, he allegedly mocked them offstage. He preached compassion, yet reportedly abandoned his own daughter. For Carson, the contradiction was too much to stomach. He once remarked privately, "Jerry could make you laugh unless you work for him. Then he just made you cry." To Johnny, Lewis represented everything false about show business, a man who could act like a saint in public while behaving like a tyrant in private. The second name was Don Rickles, the insult comic who didn't know when to stop. Rickles built his fame on cutting humor, roasting celebrities and ordinary people alike with rapid-fire insults that audiences found hilarious. He was nicknamed Mr. Warmth for the irony of his act, and his appearances with Carson were legendary for their energy and unpredictability. Yet behind the scenes, Rickles was anything but warm. According to those close to the show, his on-stage persona wasn't an act, it was simply who he was. He carried his barbed wit everywhere, using it not as a comedic tool, but as a weapon. Writers and producers, even guests, recalled how he would humiliate or mock people without the buffer of humor. Carson, ever the professional, remained friendly with Rickles in public, but privately found him exhausting. He respected Rickles's comedic genius, but detested his inability to turn off the hostility. "Don doesn't have a switch," one producer remembered Carson saying. "He just has different targets." While other comedians could compartmentalize their stage personas from their real selves, Rickles seemed unable or unwilling to make that distinction. The same sharp tongue that thrilled audiences became a source of pain for the people who worked with him. Carson saw in Rickles not just a mean streak, but a flaw of character, a man incapable of kindness unless it was part of the act. Bob Hope, America's beloved comedian, carried an image of warmth, patriotism, and family values that endured for decades. His tireless work entertaining troops overseas made him a national hero, and his clean-cut humor defined wholesome American comedy for generations. Yet, according to Johnny Carson's private observations, that image masked a much darker reality. Hope's charm and wit on stage contrasted sharply with his cold and calculating demeanor behind the scenes. A former Tonight Show staff member recalled that while Johnny deeply respected Hope's dedication to the troops, he was disturbed by the man's duplicity. To Carson, Hope lived a double life, one that would have shattered his audience's idealized perception of him. For Carson, the most obvious example of that contrast was Hope's marriage. while he publicly masqueraded as a loyal husband to his wife, Dolores. Those close to him said he had a string of affairs with showgirls, actresses, and assistants throughout his career. He entertained the troops and betrayed his family, said a former NBC executive who knew both men. Carson, with an old-fashioned sense of loyalty and authenticity, considered such rank hypocrisy repellent. In his view, Hope's wholesome public image was based on a falsehood. Beyond his personal life, Hope's professional conduct also troubled Carson. Behind the smile and one-liners was a man described by former colleagues as being politically calculating and ruthlessly ambitious. He was less interested in making people laugh and more concerned with sustaining power and influence within the entertainment industry. As one writer who worked with both men put it, by the end, Bob Hope understood power better than comedy. Hope cultivated powerful political connections, befriending presidents, and wielding those relationships to protect his career long after his comedic style had faded from relevance. Carson, who believed that comedians should challenge authority rather than cozy up to it, found Hope's behavior disheartening. He viewed comedy as a form of truth-telling, not self-preservation. Hope, in his opinion, had crossed that line, becoming part of the establishment rather than an observer of it. Privately, Carson summed up his disappointment with typical dry wit. Hope brought laughs to war zones and heartbreak to hotel rooms. Milton Berle, television's first superstar, was another name on Carson's private blacklist. Affectionately known to the public as Uncle Milty and Mr. Television, Berle revolutionized American entertainment in the late 1940s and early 1950s. His variety show was so popular that restaurants and theaters would close on Tuesday nights because everyone was home watching him. But behind his trailblazing success, Carson saw a man consumed by ego and driven by an insatiable hunger for attention. People who worked with both men remembered that Berle's fame had inflated his sense of self-importance to monstrous proportions. He bullied younger comics, belittled colleagues, and demanded constant admiration. What disturbed Carson the most was Berle's reputation for stealing material. In comedy circles, Berle was notorious for going to other comedian shows and writing down their best jokes, to then do them as his own. Among his peers, he had the mocking nickname, the Thief of Bad Gags. For Carson, plagiarism was an absolute no-no-way breaking of the unwritten code that linked comedians together. According to one of Johnny's former writers, to him, stealing jokes was the cardinal sin of comedy. But Berle's behavior went beyond professional misconduct. He was notorious for his crude humor, inappropriate conduct, and boastful stories about his personal life, particularly his anatomy. Industry insiders said he would often make lewd remarks or even expose himself to prove his claims. He didn't just tell dirty jokes, he lived them, recalled a longtime NBC employee. Carson valued professionalism and dignity, and such antics struck him as vulgar and demeaning. What disturbed Carson most, however, was Berle's treatment of those who worked under him. He ruled his shows with intimidation, berating writers, stagehands, and assistants whenever things didn't go his way. Berle came up in vaudeville, where the star was king, one producer explained. Johnny came up in television, where teamwork mattered. He thought Berle's bullying was outdated and cruel. Carson never forgot the stories of Berle's arrogance and mistreatment of others. In private, he would shake his head and joke, "You didn't shake his hand. You just braced for impact." Rosie O'Donnell, famously coined the Queen of Nice, burst onto the scene after Johnny Carson had retired. But she still managed to earn a place on his extended list of comedians whose public and private personas were starkly different. According to those who remained in Carson's circle in the years after his departure from The Tonight Show, Johnny took particular notice of O'Donnell's contrasting reputations. On air, she was friendly, relatable. Behind the scenes, however, she was allegedly volatile and cruel. According to one former Tonight Show staffer who remained close to Carson in his later years, he couldn't get enough of how O'Donnell would package herself as kind while reportedly creating a hostile work environment. It was exactly the kind of phoniness that always set Johnny's teeth on edge, the staffer said. The daytime talk show, which ran from 1996 to 2002, cemented O'Donnell as one of America's most beloved television personalities. She exuded a sense of warmth, humor, and sincerity on screen, and yet story after story from former producers and staff told a very different tale of angry outbursts, unreasonable demands, and colleagues mistreated. "She made America laugh, then made producers quit," said one television director who had worked with her. To Carson, who put such store by professionalism and authenticity, this was the ultimate hypocrisy. Over the years, O'Donnell's veneer began to crack. The heated feuds with co-hosts on The View and the very public clashes with celebrities exposed a hot temper that belied the endlessly kind Queen of Nice that had been trotted out earlier. According to people who knew him, Carson was not surprised. He reportedly believed that a performer's true nature always finds a way to surface. "The camera doesn't lie, at least not forever," Carson once said, according to a former NBC executive. He was fond of saying that people could keep up a false image for some time, but that authenticity, or a lack of it, would finally show itself. But what disturbed Carson in particular about figures like O'Donnell was how they would use charitable causes and advocacy to polish their public image while mistreating the very people that worked to support them. To him, that was a kind of moral duplicity, a betrayal of what comedy was supposed to be about. A performer's credibility, he felt, was his most valuable asset. Once that was squandered, so was the audience's trust. As Carson once dryly noted, the only thing louder than her jokes was the sound of people walking off set. Lucille Ball, the legendary star of I Love Lucy, held a complicated place in Carson's private thoughts. Ball created one of the most loved characters in television history, the clumsy, sweet, and endearing Lucy Ricardo. Her impeccable timing and physical comedy made her an icon, while her groundbreaking role as the first woman to lead a major television studio, Desilu Productions, etched her as a powerful pioneer in the industry. But according to Carson's observations, that trailblazing success came with an iron fist that few outside Hollywood ever saw. "She was beloved publicly, but iron-fisted privately," said a former NBC executive who worked with both stars. Carson admired Ball's brilliance as a performer and respected her accomplishments as a businesswoman. But he was disturbed by reports of her brutal treatment of writers, producers, and other creative talent. Those who toiled for her at Desilu described a regime of fear and intimidation. Ball, they said, held absolute power over her domain, firing abruptly, forgiving slowly, and tolerating little in the way of dissent. She could be fierce and cutting, sometimes cruel, when crossed. "Funny on screen, terrifying off it," said one veteran television producer. According to close friends and colleagues, Carson believed her ferocity was less a product of malice than of insecurity and overwhelming compulsion to remain in control within a male-dominated industry that regarded women as little more than ornaments. Despite his discomfort with her management style, Carson's feelings toward Ball were complex. He was aware of the difficulties that had come her way when she was a woman in power during the medium's early years, and he knew her toughness had been a survival mechanism as much as a personality trait. Still, he believed that great success did not justify cruelty. As one of his former writers summarized it best, Johnny thought you could be demanding without being demeaning. What most troubled Carson, however, was the disconnect between Ball's on-air persona and her off-camera reality. On screen, she was warm, spontaneous, and affectionate. Off, she was feared as one of Hollywood's most daunting executives. For Carson, such a dichotomy devalued the authenticity of that viewer relation he so deeply believed in, to say nothing of constituting a kind of fraud. His feelings once found quietly witty expression. She didn't just break the mold, she broke everyone who questioned it. Buddy Hackett, often described as a wild man with no boundaries, made his career as a lovably crude comedian. His chubby face and elastic expressions made him beloved to the audience, and his appearances on The Tonight Show were guaranteed to push the envelope and leave Johnny Carson in stitches. But sources close to Carson remembered that the host's private opinion of Hackett was far less favorable. Hackett, they said, was foul-mouthed and aggressively nasty when he wasn't on the air. Johnny valued his talent and thought him professionally hilarious, but he was deeply disturbed by the way Hackett treated women and underlings. Many accounts detailed Hackett indulging in behavior that far exceeded his onstage persona. He groped female staff members, made demeaning comments about their appearances, and created situations crew members dreaded. As a former NBC page recalled, he didn't tell jokes. He tested limits. While Carson appreciated the right blue joke in a backroom, Hackett seemed to make every interaction a chance to cross a line between comedy and cruelty. Former producers remembered that Johnny, backstage and even at industry gatherings, often had to clean up after Hackett's offenses. Unlike an isolated mistake or poor judgment, there was intent behind Hackett's bad behavior, which is what stayed with Carson as perhaps Hackett's core character flaw. You didn't sit next to Buddy at a party. You ducked, one insider remembered Carson dryly concluding. A more disturbing case on Carson's private list was Bill Cosby. Cosby, the quintessential TV dad, crafted a wholesome, family-friendly image that seemed almost untouchable, from his clean comedy albums to his groundbreaking role on I Spy and finally as Dr. Cliff Huxtable on The Cosby Show. He came off as a model of morality and charm. Yet, according to accounts from those close to Carson, some troubling industry rumors and patterns of behavior caused the host to become increasingly wary. At one point, Carson allegedly clamped restrictions on Cosby's appearances on The Tonight Show, though he never publicly explained why. For Carson, the disconnect was between Cosby's public persona and private behavior. Behind the mask of America's favorite TV dad, reportedly Cosby was involved in conduct that later became well documented, but was only suspect to Hollywood insiders at the time. For Johnny, who appreciated integrity and kindness in the people he worked with, it bothered him deeply that a man so worshipped by the public could be so destructive behind closed doors. According to a former producer, Carson always managed to find a discreet way to distance himself from people he didn't trust, and Cosby fit into the category. When the public finally learned decades later the extent of Cosby's crimes, many realized that Carson had seemed to sense something was seriously wrong well before those revelations went public. Taking in the whole of Carson's mental blacklist of 8 comedians, a pattern seems clear: a fundamental disjunction between public persona and private behavior. Carson's former head writer explained that he thought comedy required a certain emotional distance and ability to perceive absurdity, including human suffering. Some comedians developed this skill through professional craft. Others, he thought, had it because of unresolved emotional or psychological issues. Many successful comedians, according to Carson, came from troubled backgrounds, experiencing neglect, abuse, or social rejection, which gave them insight into human behavior, but sometimes impaired their empathy and emotional regulation. Carson intuitively knew that comedy often masks pain. As one producer remembered his saying, "Comedy comes from pain." He knew that many of the great comedians used humor as a way to defend themselves or cope. The line was crossed when this mechanism became so embedded that it allowed cruelty or the Matthews-like dismissal of the feelings of others. Carson himself was somewhat emotionally guarded, but he drew boundaries that kept his colleagues in their place even when he was standoffish. Those performers who disturbed him most, he felt, were those who used celebrity, influence, or fortune to get away with treating people badly with impunity. Another factor Carson observed was the corrosive effect of unchecked success. Comedians like Jerry Lewis, Milton Berle, and later Bill Cosby reached such heights of fame that they became surrounded by enablers who shielded them from criticism. Audience laughter was like a drug, a former writer recalled Carson saying. Those addicted to validation could become bitter, entitled, and increasingly incapable of normal social interaction. Carson viewed these cases, particularly that of Lucille Ball, as cautionary tales about the psychological toll of fame and the necessity of humility. Above all, Johnny never forgot that his job was to make people laugh, not to build monuments to himself. That humility, his former executive producer noted, protected him from the destructive effects of fame that he saw ruin so many others.